Of the games I consider to be my all-time favorites, Breath of the Wild probably has the most flaws. Its exaggerated emphasis on freedom felt insanely refreshing following games like Skyward Sword and Twilight Princess, which were dragged down by exhausting tutorials and unhelpful interruptions, but this focus caused much of the content within Breath of the Wild's beautiful overworld to feel lacking, whether that be its underwhelming divine beasts, repetitive enemy encounters, or overly simplistic shrines. For me, that trade-off was absolutely worth it, but a lot of fans criticized Breath of the Wild for not having strong, traditional Zelda content. I think this argument is somewhat misguided though, because of all the series' games, Breath of the Wild felt the most like a sequel to the original Legend of Zelda. Other games instead followed A Link to the Past template for dungeon design and story progression, and that game's structure is what we all collectively understood Zelda to be. Before Breath of the Wild, this series' evolution was seen as linear, where A Link to the Past streamlined and reworked the basics of Zelda 1 and the preceding games just carried along, but now it feels more like two separate lines. While Zelda 1's total commitment to freedom inspires games about player empowerment, discovery, and creativity, using A Link to the Past's more linear, funneled blueprint causes Zelda games to focus on curated gameplay and plot moments. Then there's Zelda 2. This distinction isn't an explicit dichotomy, of course. Uncovering Wind Waker's massive Great Sea wasn't too dissimilar to exploring Zelda 1's Hyrule, and A Link Between Worlds, despite literally reusing A Link to the Past's map, had a non-linear order for its final dungeons that was reminiscent of the series' first game, but generally speaking, Zelda games can be categorized through these two lenses. When it was announced that Breath of the Wild would be receiving a direct sequel, many hoped that this next game could merge the best of both worlds by combining Zelda 1 Zelda's freedom and respect for its players with A Link to the Past Zelda's more memorable dungeon design and satisfying plot moments. And while we got that blend in some ways, Tears of the Kingdom feels far more like Zelda 1 Zelda than I was expecting, and despite the criticism Breath of the Wild received, it opts to retain that game's commitment to player freedom and doubles down on many of its predecessor's most controversial mechanics. This doesn't mean nothing has been changed or improved, but instead of removing fans' points of contention, Tears recontextualizes or repurposes those pre-existing systems, often to great success. As with Breath of the Wild, however, Tears of the Kingdom has fundamental design flaws that hold it back from being as great as it could be, and if Breath of the Wild is going to be the basis for future games, as Eiji Aonuma has suggested, it's worth examining how Tears of the Kingdom takes its predecessor's foundation and iterates upon it, refines it, and stagnates with it, because it can inform us of both where this series is headed and where it stands to be improved. To start positively, Tears of the Kingdom does a great job of revamping what was arguably Breath of the Wild's most controversial mechanic in weapon durability. In that game, it felt like larger fights would force you to lose 2 or 3 of your weapons because they broke so frequently, and, especially in the late game, it was more advantageous to just avoid battles entirely because enemy weapons and chest rewards would never be as powerful as the weapons you would lose to get them. While a restriction like this has the power to push players into creatively exploring different options, the main flaw with this system was that it made combat feel wasteful because other games have conditioned audiences to not needlessly expend resources. Resident Evil, for example, is a game with little ammunition, and this scarcity requires players to wisely pick their battles and avoid enemies whenever possible. Loading all of your bullets into a random zombie can completely ruin your save file, and taking even one shot often feels like a massive decision. This is great design for a game intending to create tension, but Breath of the Wild was not a survival horror game, and the weapons' fragility psychologically evoked that same anxiety caused by resource scarcity, and anxiety is a terrible emotion to feel towards a combat system that's meant to reward curiosity. To the game's credit, the mechanic shined early on when you weren't invested in your weapons because the combat was able to capture the chaotic, unpredictable tone it wanted to, but the developers pushed a lot of players away by making the weapons too fragile. As a result, the excellent enemy design and interesting tools players could mess around with went underappreciated by many, with so many potentially memorable or fun moments being avoided because of the fragility. Tears of the Kingdom largely fixes this weapon durability issue by making weapons feel like glass again. It would have been easy for the developers to just make weapons last longer, but they instead added a new mechanic in Fusion that cleverly improves the player's emotional response to the durability system. Fusion is simple to understand, but likely required an absurd amount of effort to program, as any item that the player finds throughout the world can be attached to their weapons, shields, or arrows. For some examples, rocks can be attached to swords to make hammers, spikes can be attached to shields to inflict damage while you're defending, and certain fruit can be attached to arrows to summon elemental effects. But beyond providing fun options for players to experiment with, Fusion incentivizes you to fight difficult enemies because the parts that monsters drop when defeated are the strongest items you can fuse onto your weapons. In Breath of the Wild, these items were used as ingredients for elixirs, materials for armor upgrades, or objects you could sell for rupees, but now enemy drops immediately make you stronger in combat while they can still serve those original purposes. You're not killing Hinoxes and Moblins in Tears of the Kingdom merely for the limited and situational usefulness of the items they drop, but specifically because the weapons you're expending while fighting them are ultimately earning you better weapons for the future. This relationship between combat and fusion is reinforced by enemies such as taluses and flux constructs dropping specific items upon death that can't be picked up as they can only be used for fusion. The game wants you to be rewarded for fighting enemies now, not punished. Tears of the Kingdom's fusion ability, and the way that monster drops interact with that system by making your weapons stronger, makes combat extrinsically rewarding while Breath of the Wild's often wasn't, and this new comfortability in combat allows players to experiment with their tools more freely, while the durability mechanic is now able to achieve its original goals of creating chaotic situations and forcing players to use different weapon types. The mechanic isn't perfect though. The inability to fuse items in the menu is baffling. Having to drop the parts you want to fuse mid-battle is cumbersome, and the interface for attaching items to arrows definitely needed streamlining, but as a whole, fusion is an overwhelmingly positive addition to the game that spins one of Breath of the Wild's greatest flaws into a strength. Fusion isn't even the mechanic that best encourages player creativity though, because Ultrahand provides limitless possibilities for combat encounters, overworld traversal, and puzzle solutions. The ability to move and attach different objects gives utility to basically everything in Hyrule, but I want to mainly explore the mechanic's positive impact on shrines. Breath of the Wild's shrines were conceptually great, being isolated mini-dungeons scattered across Hyrule that rewarded exploration by being fun to complete and making players stronger. In a world so vast, this kind of content was a smart way to give every nook and cranny of Hyrule purpose, but the design of the shrines themselves was dicey. At their best, these challenges would present inventive puzzles that developed in complexity throughout the shrine or required players to think critically about the nature of the room they were in. At their worst, these challenges would be brain-dead simple and solvable in 45 seconds, and a disappointingly high amount of the shrines fell into that latter category. Inconsistent shrine quality was compounded even further by the inclusion of 20 identical combat rooms, which all had the player fight the exact same enemy at varying difficulties, and the enjoyability of the game's shrine quests was spotty too. In a game with such a fascinating world, it felt like the developers didn't have the necessary time or resources to design better puzzles, which unfortunately reduced the player's desire to explore. Tears of the Kingdom reuses this shrine formula, but because Ultrahand and the other abilities you receive are far more versatile than Stasis, Magnesis, Cryonis, and Bombs were, and more development time seems to have been put into designing the puzzles, the shrines themselves do a far better job of inventively applying the game's mechanics and rewarding the player's creativity. For one of my favorite examples, look at Forward Force. Like many of Tears of the Kingdom shrines, Forward Force takes a Zonai device, in this instance the Big Wheel, and applies it in a variety of clever ways. The first puzzle is simple. The player only needs to guide a large orb over a pool of lava by attaching it to a pre-made vehicle. This teaches the player how the wheel works, and the next puzzle requires them to think about it in a completely new context, where a stone slab needs to be connected to the wheel so its rotation can propel this platform, and by extension the orb, upwards. Then, finally, the player needs to guide the orb across some water, which can be accomplished by creating a boat of sorts where the wheels are used as makeshift paddles, or the wheels can be lined up on top of these walls so the orb can just drive across. Forward Force not only has a core idea that's given satisfying development through increasingly difficult puzzles, but it also requires the player to demonstrate cognitive flexibility by using the wheel in ways dissimilar to its primary function. The reason Tears is able to provide its objects with numerous purposes like this is because of the game's incredible physics engine, which is astoundingly complex. A great example that showcases the physics engine is Lever Power, a shrine that utilizes force, acceleration caused by gravity, torque, and projectile motion to challenge the player with a fun puzzle. When the game is able to push the player into this kind of spatial thinking while presenting them with creative and well-developed ideas, these shrines offer some of Tears of the Kingdom's best content, and there are plenty of positive examples to cite. Deep Force presents quirky puzzles related to buoyancy with 3 challenges that escalate in difficulty. Building Bridges has the player positioning numerous bridges in unorthodox ways with Ultrahand to progress to the end, and Fire and Ice test the player's understanding of friction by making them use an ice block as a base for another block so they both can slide down a spiky ramp. Beyond just being fun though, the shrines help your brain understand what's possible with the Zonai devices, Link's abilities, and the game's physics engine, which in turn improves your capacity to creatively solve problems throughout the entire game. On my second playthrough, I found myself going into shrines I struggled with initially, only to realize that there were significantly easier solutions that I hadn't considered at first. Built to Carry's final puzzle has the player building some kind of device that can carry this orb down a declined rail, and I first built this complex question mark looking platform, which worked, but on my second playthrough I quickly built a significantly simpler hanger that got the job done just as well. The puzzle hadn't changed, but my understanding of Ultrahand and the physics engine had, and it was because of the game's well-designed shrines that I was able to find an easier alternative. At this point, it's tempting to say that Tears of the Kingdom shrines are definite successes, but their roles as teachers lead to unexpected drawbacks that make a lot of them overly simplistic, because given the openness of the world, the player may already know the lessons a shrine is trying to teach. And I'm not exclusively referencing the training shrines, which there are far too many of, but also the large portion of shrines that are designed to teach players about a specific Zonai device. Take a sliding device as an example. This shrine is placed in Karakara Bazaar, a plot-relevant location, and the game uses the opportunity to showcase how sleds can quickly slide over the desert sand. And this is a problem, because even though I just complimented the shrines for how they wonderfully expose players to new possibilities, there's a chance that the player already has an understanding of how sleds work before they reach a sliding device, meaning the lessons taught by the shrine could become redundant. But while Forward Force showed that shrines can simultaneously teach a player a concept and still provide them with interesting challenges, a lot of the game's shrines that try to teach players fail because their puzzles just aren't demanding enough. A sliding device is one such shrine. First, the player hops onto a sled that's running down a sandy slope and then uses recall on it, and then they modify a sled using a fan and a controller, and the shrine is over. And if you're wondering, finding the optional chest isn't even accomplished by solving a puzzle, as it only requires the player to briefly drive in a different direction. It's just added time. To underscore the problem and provide a counterexample of a shrine that's able to both teach and challenge players, Bridging the Sands also features sleds in a similar context, but the puzzles here are far more engaging and varied than those of a sliding device. In a way, Bridging the Sands could effectively replace a sliding device as a tutorial while also being an enjoyable experience for those already familiar with sleds, and when one shrine can essentially make another shrine redundant like this, the weaker shrine probably needs better content. Disappointingly, a lack of complexity characterizes some other shrines that don't focus on Zonai devices too. Alignment contains one incredibly simple puzzle where the player just rotates different pieces of a tower and ascends upward to reach the end. Rise and Fall is about using recall on moving blocks to progress, which is an interaction that players have likely done dozens of times already, with all three of its puzzles basically being the exact same, and Spinning Gears similarly reuses a concept from one of the tutorial shrines with two identical and boring gear puzzles. The problems don't end there though, as the sky is home to a lot of the game's weakest shrines, and there are far too many blessings both in the sky and on the ground that don't feel earned. There's one shrine on top of the frigid mountain next to the Gerudo Desert that's clearly sitting out in the open, but you're rewarded with a blessing. It's like the game is handing out a participation award. A different shrine that's in Korok Forest requires the player to exchange golden apples for a crystal, with the necessary amount of fruit being at the end of a difficult path. This is a fun concept, but I already had enough golden apples upon arrival, meaning I was rewarded with a blessing for merely handing over some food I had absent-mindedly collected hours beforehand. I'm saving my biggest critique of the shrines for a later section as it will fit better there, but to summarize my thoughts for now, while I'm impressed that the developers were able to create as many interesting shrines as they did, and the ones in Tears of the Kingdom are a definite improvement over those found in Breath of the Wild, I don't think the shrine concept works at such a high quantity. With 152 different ones, there are bound to be duds, and I think getting the number of them down to 80 or so would allow each one to receive a sufficient amount of attention. It's likely that players were less concerned for Tears' mini dungeons as they were for the game's main dungeons, though. Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts were infamously disappointing, because the process of completing them, from beginning to end, was incredibly repetitive. All of the Divine Beasts had similar boarding sequences, they all shared the same interior aesthetic, they all could be physically rotated in some way, they all had isolated terminals that could be activated in any order, and they all had bosses that looked the same, were defeated in the same general way, and each lacked any semblance of character. This predictability incurred disinterest from the player, because it was impossible to get excited about exploring a new dungeon when you already knew exactly what it would look like and what you would be doing in it. While the dungeons in past Zelda games most certainly had a formula, where the player would get a new item halfway through that uncovered the rest of the dungeon and was needed to defeat the main boss, the gameplay experience inside of each would often feel different. Ocarina of Time's Forest Temple had the player track down 4 ghosts, the Water Temple required them to raise and lower the water level to make certain rooms accessible, and the Shadow Temple was a linear gauntlet of difficult enemies and standalone puzzles. By comparison, exploring each divine beast lacked that variety, and the quality of the puzzles inside of the beasts was disappointing too. It was as if the game's most boring shrines were shoved into compact areas, and despite a few clever moments coming from the ability to rotate them, Breath of the Wild's divine beasts lacked the character, identity, and interconnected complexity that defines the series' best dungeons. In a lot of ways, Tears of the Kingdom's temples are just as flawed. The terminal concept is reused, with short puzzles being approachable in any order, and the ability to physically move the dungeons, which was the strongest attribute of the divine beasts, is now absent. There is a similar hint of repetition and simplicity here, but the unique means of traversal within each dungeon allow them to feel more clearly distinct from one another. The Fire Temple has the player changing the direction of rails and riding on minecarts, the Water Temple is set in low gravity, and the Lightning Temple opens with a linear journey through some catacombs before the player emerges into the central chamber. The dungeons are also more visually impressive. The Water Temple, by being set in the sky, is given a much grander sense of scale, and the Fire Temple's placement in the depths creates a foreboding atmosphere, but the series has a history of more creative concepts than these. Outside of the Wind Temple, which takes the form of a massive boat in the sky, the game's dungeons are themed with about the most generic elemental templates possible. To be transparent, I was hoping Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons would be better than they are, but similarly to how Fusion positively recontextualizes weapon durability, I think the content surrounding the temples makes them feel far more meaningful. Breath of the Wild's Divine Beast Assaults were some of the most memorable set pieces of that game, but the quests beforehand were pretty insubstantial. To board Vah Ruta, all you needed to do was talk to a few Zora and have 20 shock arrows, which either led to a short but fun encounter with a Lionel, or nothing if you already had the necessary amount. Flying over Vah Medoh was a good time, but getting there only required the player to complete a simple archery minigame. By contrast, Tears demands more from the player before they enter the temples, which can sometimes necessitate some mindless busywork, but other times, just traveling to a dungeon is about as enjoyable as most Zelda dungeons are themselves. The Wind and Water Temples require the player to make lengthy treks into the sky, both of which being incredibly atmospheric and satisfying, while the Fire and Lightning Temples are preceded by unique combat challenges that are memorable in their own way. And, taking a note from Majora's Mask, completing the dungeons brings about positive changes to the surrounding areas that dramatically improve the player's ability to interact with the NPCs. Rito Village's overburdening snow disappears, as does the sludge covering Zora's domain, and the Gerudo can finally resurface as the Gibdo attacks and sandstorms subside. Breath of the Wild tried to have this relationship between its dungeons and the environments too, but the towns' ailments in that game didn't affect gameplay nearly this much. Occasional rocks falling around Death Mountain or the Rito being unable to fly didn't limit the player's gameplay capabilities, while completing Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons is far more rewarding, because restoring the affected towns opens up more content. Overall, while the temples themselves don't use the game's core mechanics as well as they should due to their simplistic puzzles and broken up nature, Tears' dungeons are a step up from Breath of the Wild due to the fun quests leading up to them and the positive effect that completing one has on the environment. The bosses at the end of the temples are a mixed bag though, because while it's great that they're all unique, some of them are far too easily exploitable. Muktarok is the perfect example here, as the concept of a little octopus man creating a sludge shark that slides around the ground is wonderfully inventive. The music has this great transition between phases that creates a playful tone, but the fight is so poorly balanced that none of these strengths end up mattering. A single hit with Sidon's water ability exposes the Octorok, and after smacking him around a bit, you can immediately hit the shark with water to expose it again. Because only one hit is needed for the boss to change phases, the shark form's attacks won't even be seen by players who are fast enough. What's the point? Muktarok really should have needed to take 3 hits before exposure, or the Octorok could have had some attacks on its own, but as it is, the fight isn't balanced well enough to present an interesting gameplay experience. Colgera is another example of this principle. This is my favorite fight in the game for a lot of reasons. It does a great job of repurposing the game's skydiving mechanics for combat, the boss's size and design are imposing, and the music's reincorporation of Dragon Roost Island's theme is just... So imagine my surprise and disappointment when I discovered that a good chunk of players simply shot Colgera's weak spots from the bottom, which, because of archery's bullet time property, can end the fight in a matter of seconds. Two of the battle's three strengths I mentioned, those being the use of skydiving and the music, can be completely invalidated by this method, which didn't affect my playthrough, but led to an underwhelming fight for a lot of the game's audience. This boss design is indicative of Tears of the Kingdom's greatest flaw, and the one flaw in Breath of the Wild that I was hoping Tears would correct the most, that being how easy it is to exploit the game's systems and avoid engaging with potentially interesting mechanics. Colgera is one example that illustrates the point, but this fundamental design problem reverberates throughout Tears of the Kingdom's entirety. Combat is at its best when players are experimenting with enemy behavior and unique weapons, but bullet time is so absurdly powerful that it's almost always the best option for defeating monsters, and Tears actually makes archery even stronger than it was in Breath of the Wild because Link now only loses stamina after shooting an arrow, giving the player as much time as they need to land easy headshot after easy headshot. The glide clothing is extremely helpful for traversal, and the armor has less defense to compensate, but because you're never in danger while in the air, and you can always open the menu and switch it to a stronger defensive set as soon as you land, upgrading the armor is a complete waste of time and resources. You can still pause and instantly heal whenever it's convenient, you can still get full heal meals from cooking only one hearty ingredient, you can still mindlessly defeat fire and ice enemy variants by throwing elemental items at them, you can still abuse the charge attack for large weapons to easily stunlock bokoblins and other enemies, and so on and so on. These are only a few examples, but the point is clear. Tears of the Kingdom's poor balance renders many of its interesting gameplay mechanics redundant. I won't dismiss these exploitations as inherent flaws though, because besides the fact that Nintendo didn't think these problems were worth fixing despite the game's lengthy development time, the designers themselves have acknowledged that exploits are an intentional part of the game's design. In an interview with Game Informer, Eiji Aonuma stated the following when asked about the player's ability to solve problems in unintended or exploitative ways. When you think about people, cheating is fun, they like it, finding that shortcut is enjoyable. People will look for an easy way to do something if they can avoid struggling. We want to make sure that is something that stayed in this game. When thinking of games in the past that we've worked on, where there was a puzzle to solve and only one answer, that's kind of the past way of developing games. Now, I'm happy that we've arrived at this method where we're giving people lots of options, and there are many answers to a single problem, and all of them can potentially be correct. This wasn't the only consideration made by the designers though, as director Hidemaru Fujibayashi noted that finding a satisfactory balance between player freedom and engaging game design was a priority during development. So on one hand, the game wants players to push against its limits and have the freedom to cheat and solve problems in their own unique ways, but the developers also don't want players to have so much freedom that the game becomes trivialized. The unfortunate problem, though, is that, even excluding the hovercraft, which hilariously invalidates Fujibayashi's example of an exploit he wanted to stop, the developers consistently fail to find that healthy balance because the restrictions they've implemented to stop players from breaking the game are insanely easy to work around. This is where I'm going to circle back to shrines, because they best exemplify the problems created by these futile restrictions. Consider Ultrahand. Objects can only be moved within a certain distance from Link, because a lack of restriction would make it possible for players to effortlessly place orbs or items wherever they wanted. This limitation is accounted for by shrines such as Forward Force, where the player's goal is to move an orb back to the beginning of the shrine, and the designers wisely placed the ball at the bottom of a large drop. Due to Ultrahand's limited vertical range, this steep drop acts as a barrier that prevents players from simply placing the ball on top of the ledge and avoiding the puzzles that I praised earlier. But if you first move the ball upwards with Ultrahand and then use Recall, an ability that causes items to retrace through their past positions, you can then go to the top of the ledge and do this. Now, there's a chance I just blew your mind, and if that's the case, it's probably because you never thought to combine these abilities in this way, which is totally understandable. You need to have a thorough understanding of both abilities to pull this trick off and bypass the intended limitation to Ultrahand's range, and finding this solution is a legitimately engaging moment of problem solving for the player. But the flaw here isn't about Forward Force individually. Rather, the problem is that the Recall and Ultrahand combination breaks so many of the game's other shrines in the same way. Fire and Water asks the player to build a tower that they can ascend through by attaching separate blocks that are obtained by solving puzzles, but Ultrahand and Recall make it possible to ignore half the shrine. Flotational Brilliance has the player messing around with buoyancy to position platforms, but you can just move the stone slabs to where they need to be, use Recall, and completely ignore all flotation. If you don't want to spend any time thinking about Built to Carry's final puzzle, you can drag the ball close to the ending platform, jump across, use Recall, and then quickly grab it, or if a balanced plan's interesting torque puzzles don't interest you, moving the seesaws into helpful positions and then using Recall allows you to be on your way. I have plenty of more shrines I could bring up, but for the sake of brevity, I think these examples should suffice. Ultrahand's limited range isn't the only example of an intended restriction failing to serve its purpose, though. Near the Rito village, Tears of the Kingdom teaches players that throwing a Hylian Pinecone into a fire summons an updraft that's similar to Revali's Gale from Breath of the Wild. It then logically follows that because you can drop and throw all of your items inside of shrines, you can quickly build a fire using some wooden fire fruit to throw a Pinecone into, breaking Tears' shrines by allowing you to effortlessly fly into the air. Except it doesn't work. The developers specifically programmed Pinecones to function differently within shrines because they understood that the updraft could completely break puzzles. As trampolines, hoverstones, and rockets can also be used for similar purposes, it makes sense that Zonai devices can't be taken out inside of shrines either. But these two programmed restrictions are rendered pointless, because even though you can't pull out rockets inside of shrines, weapons that have been fused with Zonai devices function the exact same in shrines as they do in the overworld. As a result, bringing in a rocket shield, which automatically jets the player upwards, makes it easy to accomplish the very flight that the developers were trying to stop the player from doing. Always having a rocket shield tucked away is easy too, because Zonai dispensers give you plenty of rockets, and even if you don't have a fused shield on hand, quickly exiting the shrine, attaching the Zonai device, and then re-entering is simple. Similar to the Ultrahand and Recall exploit, this solution requires a level of ingenuity at first, but once the player understands how rocket shields can break puzzles, future shrines become mindless. Building bridges can be completed like this, alignment can be completed like this, the final challenge in Built for Rails can be completed like this, a prone pathway, which has an engaging central puzzle that necessitates spatial awareness, can be completed like this, force transfer, another shrine with a great core puzzle, can be completed like this, and so on. And I'm still not done. The targets that are activated when hit by fast-moving objects often lead to great physics puzzles, but they're also activated by bomb explosions. And because bomb flowers are items that the player can always bring into the shrines and fuse to their arrows, Lever Power's interesting use of physics can be ignored, Mallet Smash's peculiar contraptions can be ignored, a well-timed bounce's creative application of Recall can be ignored, and the right roll set of puzzles, the last of which, being one of my favorite gameplay challenges in Tears of the Kingdom, can, well, you know. To explain why these exploits are such big problems, I'm going to return to Aonuma's quote. In it, he stated that, "Now, I'm happy that we've arrived at this method where we're giving people lots of options, and there are many answers to a single problem, and all of them can potentially be correct." Fujibayashi referenced a similar design goal when, during an interview that was published on Nintendo.com, he stated the following: "We often say that we should create games through multiplication. For example, we believe that taking the main character's ability and multiplying it with a world that has a lot to offer will result in a different experience for every player, every time." What both Aonuma and Fujibayashi are referencing here is their intention to increase variety by allowing problems to have numerous solutions, but the exact opposite ends up happening. You may think that I've been overly thorough with the large number of examples I've given, but the point I'm making is that shrines, instead of being different puzzles that have a multiplicity of potential solutions, all assimilate into becoming the same puzzles with the same solutions because of the game's poorly implemented restrictions. That's the problem. Building your own rail transportation device, manipulating torque to position seesaws, experimenting with buoyancy, and inventively applying the big wheel to transport an orb should be concepts that feel distinct from one another and challenge the player in different ways, but they all become the exact same puzzle when you combine Ultrahand and Recall. Using a gear's rotation to push up a set of platforms, traveling across a pool of lava, creating catapults with Zonai stabilizers, and building different bridges to progress forward should be unique problems to solve, but using a rocket shield turns all of them into the exact same shrine. Combining different spheres to create a device that can roll in a particular direction, manipulating gravity to cause a massive stone to land in particular places, aiming a catapult properly through clever application of force, and using a box's weight to give a stone slab on a rail enough momentum to slide uphill should be puzzles that cause the player to critically think about the game's physics engine in new contexts, but all of these shrines can be completed in possibly the dumbest way imaginable. For the sake of clarity and thoroughness, I've only discussed how non-existent restrictions lead to a boring sense of homogeneity within the confines of the game's shrines, but even if you don't care about the shrines or never figure out those 3 particular exploits, this problem persists throughout the game's entirety. Exploring the Hebra and Pharaon regions, which are in opposite corners of Hyrule and have completely different biomes, should feel more distinct, but it's always most efficient for players to warp to the nearest tower or a shrine in the sky, and then effortlessly glide to their desired location. This isn't terrible gameplay by any means, but this strategy causes players to engage with both areas in identical ways, while stopping them from finding methods of traversal that would give either region a stronger sense of identity. Flying on a hoverbike is enjoyable enough, but it's such an effective vehicle that many of the linear gameplay segments, such as the ascents to the wind and water temples, can be completely avoided in a way that makes these experiences the exact same. My favorite example for this principle, though, is the Gleeoks. Fights with these 3-headed dragons cause the player to frantically run around to avoid attacks while taking any opportunity they can to line up perfect shots with their bow, and the Gleeok's elemental typing forces the player to strategize about how they should use their potions and armor in tandem with one another to effectively cover different needs. As an example, if you're fighting a frost Gleeok in the snow, you might want to equip the snow boots to improve your mobility, wear one piece of armor that boosts your attack, consume a potion or meal to protect you against the cold, and then use your best defensive piece of armor to better tank hits. You might instead opt to wear some pieces of armor that protect you from the cold and use another piece to resist being frozen while using a potion to boost your attack, but depending on how much you've invested into those pieces of gear, you may be more vulnerable under this setup. This kind of strategic assessment is where the armor and potion mechanics are at their best, and the fights themselves showcase Tears' combat at its most engaging, provide the players with satisfying spectacles, allow each fight to feel distinct depending on the player's chosen strategy, and incentivize exploration by giving purpose to the different armor and resource investments made by players throughout the game. Or, instead of any of that, all of these fights, regardless of the Gleeok's typing, can become headshot spam fests, which players will naturally turn these battles into because abusing bullet time is the most efficient method for defeating them. To make matters worse, Gleeok arenas often feature small pillars or platforms that are screaming at you to jump off them, and just like that, potentially engaging content is rendered obsolete because of one easily exploitable game mechanic. An important and true counterpoint to examine is that it's not realistic for a game with so many mechanics and items to give equal versatility to all of them. It is inevitable that dominant strategies will emerge, so even if the developers found workarounds for the exploits I've mentioned, some other, most efficient methods would be overused in their stead. If bullet time was outright removed, it's incredibly likely that Gleeoks could be cheesed in some other way that would become just as routine, or if the hoverbike design was impossible to build, some other Zonai contraption would naturally replace it. What I am arguing, though, isn't that removing these individual exploits would fix the larger issue of homogenized gameplay, but rather placing restrictions that disable players from falling back on those exploits so easily would encourage the variety and creativity that the designers were aiming for. If there was some kind of limit to how often you could warp to shrines, players would then find more interesting and inventive methods of exploring Hyrule. If bullet time limited how many arrows you could shoot or operated on a cooldown, the time players would be spending endlessly landing headshots would instead be put into using the game's other, more interesting items, while archery could still be a powerful tool the player occasionally turned to. If shrines stripped Link of his resources upon entry, their puzzles would still be solvable in unintended ways, but players would be far less likely to turn to the same boring solutions over and over again. That last hypothetical in particular is worth reinforcing, because if you don't agree with me and think these kinds of restrictions would cause Tears to lose its core appeal of enabling player freedom, then you're forgetting something: the Proving Grounds. These shrine challenges are similar to Breath of the Wild's Eventide Island, a highlight of that game, where players lose their armor and items and have to defeat enemies using only what the game provides them. Beyond being massive improvements over Breath of the Wild's tests of strength, the Proving Grounds demonstrate that players will naturally become more creative when restrictions are placed upon them, as I found myself using completely different and more enjoyable methods for defeating enemies in these shrines than I was in the overworld. And that's not merely reflective of one man's experience. If you search for online forums where users discuss Tears' shrines, the Proving Grounds are almost always cited as being players' favorites, and I've even seen critics of the game's shrines set these challenges apart as exceptions to their critiques. Here's the point that all this talk about exploitations, restrictions, dominant strategies, and so on has been leading to, and it's going to sound counterintuitive. Freedom and creativity are largely antithetical, because a player's ability to find creative solutions is actually diminished when they have too much freedom, and though freedom feels great, players enjoy creativity more. Completing the Proving Ground shrines, creatively solving puzzles, building interesting vehicles, experimenting with weapons and fusion, using unique items to make combat encounters easier, and finding armor and potion combinations that effectively cover situational weaknesses are the moments where Tears of the Kingdom's gameplay is at its best, but all of these examples involve and necessitate restrictions of some kind, because players being able to do whatever they want gives them no need to be creative. Instead of inspiring players to be creative, Tears of the Kingdom merely allows them to be. But this freedom still has value because you can effectively mold Tears into becoming whatever game you desire. If you refuse to fast travel, more interesting methods of exploring Hyrule will naturally emerge, or if you think bullet time, meals, or armor upgrades are overpowered, you can simply avoid them. For me, the Sage's Vows both made enemy encounters too easy and detracted from the immersive isolation that I personally enjoy feeling in games like these, so I disabled them. That freedom to shape my own experience feels empowering in a way that most games aren't, but relying on self-imposed challenges through willpower alone to make a game engaging is far from ideal. It's like being an alcoholic that wants to sober up, but decides to keep a dozen bottles of liquor in the pantry anyway. Sure, you can just not drink those bottles, but the better alternative is to remove the temptation entirely. Similarly, you can try to not shoot bombs into targets if you want to actually use your brain to solve those puzzles, but any added frustration or resistance you experience on the way to finding a more legitimate solution makes it progressively more likely that you'll break that promise to yourself, and feeling like you have to fight your own instincts to have an enjoyable experience is not indicative of amazing game design. A dedication to player freedom, while having many benefits, causes Tears of the Kingdom to lack smart restrictions around the player's abilities, and for a game with so many cool items and mechanics that allow the player to think outside the box, it's a shame that many of them will go underexplored, because it's so easy for players to turn to the same effective yet boring solutions over and over again. Another area lacking restriction is the order in which the dragon's tears are found, which can create problems for the story. While Breath of the Wild's memories were relatively disconnected, serving as isolated scenes that lightly fleshed out Zelda and the champions as characters, Tears' memories convey a more traditional, linear narrative. It's therefore possible to see the final memories before having the context to understand what's going on, and I happened to find the last tear as my second one, which spoiled the outcome of the other scenes while I also didn't really understand the weight of Zelda's revelation. Admittedly, the game does provide the player with the order of these scenes. I'm just stubborn, but it goes to show that, even despite these memories having a clear order, the game doesn't restrict the player into experiencing it that way. Rather, the designers once again give players the freedom to choose for themselves. Some other problems arise from the conflict between Tears' open world and its linear narrative, mostly caused by the disconnect between what the player knows and what the characters around them know. As an example to clarify that point, once you've pieced together that Zelda is the Light Dragon, it's obvious that the Zelda scene after the upheaval isn't her. You, and therefore Link, should be able to communicate this to the other characters, but you still can't access the final ring ruin in Kakariko Village until you've cleared Hyrule Castle first, because that's the only point where the game can be certain you understand that the real Zelda didn't actually warn the villagers to stay away from it. This type of dissonance created between the player and the world is one of the reasons why writing a satisfying narrative in a game this open can be really difficult, but Breath of the Wild opted to not try. That game's story lacked the dramatic moments or twists that earlier games had used to spice up the generic defeat Ganon save Zelda formula, the memories didn't explore Zelda's struggle to awaken her powers beyond a surface level, and the game's ending, which included an underwhelming final boss encounter, felt anticlimactic. As I've mentioned, Breath of the Wild was aiming to recapture Zelda 1 in a lot of ways, but this NES type of minimalist writing left the game feeling hollow. A benefit to this storytelling approach, though, was that the plot got out of the way and didn't infringe upon the gameplay, and at first, Tears of the Kingdom seems to unfortunately backtrack on that strength. After landing in Hyrule, the player is jerked around as characters constantly redirect Link, and most of the early dialogue consists of NPCs mirroring back the story of Zelda's disappearance that Link tells them, which is always a waste of time because you already know what happened to her, but thankfully, once you get the paraglider, the game mostly gets out of your way. This all leads into a story about saving Zelda and Hyrule that's about as simple as the one found in Breath of the Wild, but the memories' relevance to Link adds much needed drama, and the overall presentation of the narrative is far stronger too. Even though it's predictable, seeing Zelda place her faith in Link and sacrifice herself by turning into the Light Dragon gives your ultimate goal of defeating Ganondorf more weight, and Link pulling the Master Sword from the Light Dragon's brow might be the coolest moment the series has ever had. I say might there because the final confrontation with Ganondorf is about as climactic as anyone could have hoped for. Despite having no more depth than he did in Ocarina of Time, Ganondorf's ominous voice and imposing physical presence make him a significantly more entertaining antagonist than Calamity Ganon was, and the build-up to the final battle, where the player revisits the catacombs from the beginning of the game as the soundtrack's sinister reversed voices escalate in a thunderous crescendo, conveys a satisfying sense of finality. Topped off with a fun boss fight, this finale is already significantly stronger than Breath of the Wild, but Tears of the Kingdom has one final trick up its sleeve. The Dark Beast Ganon fight in Breath of the Wild was disappointing because the core fight with Calamity Ganon was underwhelming to begin with. Players hoped this final phase would retroactively make the entire battle more gratifying, but because it was intended to be more of a spectacle than a fight, defeating the Dark Beast was incredibly easy. The Demon Dragon is similarly simplistic, but the spectacle feels more earned this time because the boss battle with Ganondorf, alongside the fight against his army beforehand, is a satisfying experience by itself, and flying around in the sky is far more exhilarating than aimlessly riding around on a horse. But as strong as its peak moments are, Tears' story still has some disappointing weaknesses, most notably the cutscenes concluding the temples. The faceless, nameless original sages each has the personality of a Thomas Bagel, and the scenes where they recount the imprisoning war are blatantly copied and pasted, with reused lines of dialogue and stills. Other characters fare a little bit better, but too many of them have stoic, detached demeanors that make it difficult to distinguish them from one another, with Rauru, Sonia, and Minoru in particular lacking interesting characterization. Despite Breath of the Wild's blandness seeping through in a few instances, Tears of the Kingdom's plot is still a clear strength of the game, with the ending being no exception. The player successfully catching Zelda as she plummets through the sky after Link failed to do so at the beginning of the game is a nice way to bring everything full circle and round out the game's theme of collaboration. And though I'm not entirely sure how the news that Zelda has spent thousands of years as a hairy dragon impacts the two's romantic endeavors, I guess there's always the next game to explore that. But is this scene ending more than Tears of the Kingdom? While I'm certain this is the final time we'll see this iteration of Hyrule, Eiji Aonuma has mentioned that Breath of the Wild will act as a template of sorts for future 3D installments, which has me both excited and worried. On one hand, I've genuinely loved these past two Zelda games. They evoke a stronger sense of adventure than basically everything I've played, and the core mechanics feel so alive that just aimlessly gliding or running around is enjoyable. But on the other hand, I'm left thinking that, despite the enjoyment I've had with Tears of the Kingdom, there's still so much room for improvement, which is exactly what I felt after finishing Breath of the Wild, and I won't be surprised at all if I'm thinking the same thing a few years down the line whenever the next game comes out. Because, beyond the smaller weaknesses that I've already discussed, there are two fundamental design flaws getting in the way of this series reaching its highest potential, the first being its unnecessarily radical emphasis on player freedom. That might sound somewhat strange coming out of my mouth, because I strongly believe that games, alongside all forms of art or media for that matter, are best when they commit to a focused artistic vision despite the flaws that might come attached. If you look at the games that I consider to be my all-time favorites, you'll notice that many of them have legitimate flaws, but almost all of those flaws are natural byproducts of their strengths. Majora's Mask and Outer Wilds sometimes ask the player to boringly wait around for time-based events to occur and can be overly punishing to players that make mistakes, but those are worthwhile concessions that both games needed to make so their worlds can dynamically evolve in satisfying ways. Metroid Prime and Resident Evil require players to frequently backtrack, but that annoyance is a necessary result of the amazing sense of progression that players feel by uncovering these games' once unfamiliar environments. Tears of the Kingdom seems to share this characteristic, in that many of its problems are intrinsically tied to its strength of giving players so much freedom, but I'm not convinced the game's weaknesses are so fundamental that they can't be improved without sabotaging that core appeal. Unlike a game such as Shadow of the Colossus, where the flaws of its empty overworld and unconventional controls can't be fixed without innately damaging its artistic vision, the next Zelda game could still emphasize freedom in areas where it works, while restrictively encouraging creativity in areas where it doesn't. I've already explained why I think freedom and creativity don't blend, but that isn't to say both can't coexist within the same game. Rather, shifting focus and prioritizing one over the other at any given time could allow both freedom and creativity to shine at different moments. Freely exploring the world at your own pace, having the choice between increasing health or stamina with your spirit orbs, and being able to defeat the final boss whenever you want are examples of freedom being applied successfully. At the other end of the quality spectrum, dungeon puzzles being completable in any order seems to be the result of the designers focusing on player freedom, but after playing 2 games with underwhelming dungeons, I'm comfortable claiming that this concept doesn't work. Here's the point though, there's no reason dungeons can't be more linear while the game's other mechanics that benefit from freedom remain the same, and Tears already has numerous examples of restrictive gameplay segments anyway. The Proving Ground Shrines, the Thunderhead Isles, and the depths beneath Hyrule Castle offer linear, restrictive challenges, and these sections are all the better for it. In a game with such a breadth of dissimilar moments and mechanics, the developers approaching all of them through the same lens has caused many of them to squander their potential, and going outside of the freedom-fits-all approach could enable every section of the game to be designed in a more appropriate and engaging way. And this high number of different gameplay mechanics leads me into my second concern, and the characteristic of Tears of the Kingdom that worries me about where this series is headed the most: the size of it. Instead of using the extra time that was afforded by the reuse of Breath of the Wild's map and assets to solely focus on improving the quality of content, much of Tears' development was spent making an already massive world even larger and stuffing it with even more trivial busywork. The game has 152 shrines, 147 bubble gems, 120 light roots, 139 side quests, 81 Addison signs, 45 potential energy cell upgrades that require 100 crystallized charges each, and, of course, an unholy amount of Koroks. It would be disingenuous of me to assert that players are expected to complete all this content, but the sheer magnitude and meaninglessness of it all is exhausting. So much of a player's time in Tears of the Kingdom will likely be spent collecting items and trinkets for no cognitive reason, but the feeling that you're making some sort of progress by collecting something or scratching out an item on a checklist hacks our brains into feeling like we're being productive, when, in reality, our minds and bodies have been completely disengaged the entire time. Now, I'm not cynically dismissing games as inherently worthless, but the point I'm making is that the metaphorical dopamine drip feed this kind of collecting and busy work creates makes it easy to spend a shocking amount of time in Tears of the Kingdom with an emotionless detachment as you run up to items that you neither want nor need and pick them up anyways, simply because hearing a pleasant sound effect after grabbing something is enough to motivate people into performing the most vapid actions imaginable. Spending an extra minute in every cave to find hidden bubble frogs that ultimately rewarded me with an armor set I never used led to zero interesting or memorable gameplay experiences, but I collected an asinine amount of gems anyway, and even after I had activated all of the light roots, I still found myself instinctively climbing up cave walls to collect bright bloom seeds that I no longer needed. Perhaps I'm to blame for falling into this psychological trap, and Nintendo are only doing the sensible thing by taking advantage of our innate craving to experience this shallow sense of growth. After all, modern game design as a whole is predominantly about exploiting this part of our brains for financial gain, but this kind of busy work dilutes the moment-to-moment gameplay with an ocean of forgettable filler. A series that once thematically conveyed the importance of time, The Legend of Zelda is getting dangerously close to becoming a series that's designed to consume the player's time, and while the quality of Tears of the Kingdom's content thankfully isn't too hampered by the quantity of it, just how far will this design philosophy take us? Who's to say the next game won't have 180 shrines, 226 side quests, 30 towers to activate, 211 caves, and 1,796 Koroks? There's now precedent that open-world Zelda is about making a bigger and denser game than the one prior, and if this is Nintendo's approach moving forward, the quality of these games will dramatically decline as the sheer vanity of running up to items and collecting them for unengaging reasons will become overwhelming. This is a series that has shown an astounding willingness to challenge itself and surprise its fanbase though. While my concerns have basis, I'm also optimistic that Nintendo can continue to blow my mind just as effectively as they did with Tears of the Kingdom, because despite its many flaws, there are few games that even come close to providing me with the same level of wonder.
I don't know, man. You've been seeming sus lately. It's almost like we have an imposter among us. I saw that you wanted— Don't lie to me, you sussy baka!